Let's take a closer look at how route controllers work by building a custom loading indicator. If you've used Iron Router, you know that there's already an out-of-box hook that does loading indicators for you. But by going through this exercise, you'll get a better understanding of how the waitOn function works and how we can use the data function and customize the action function. Let's start by customizing the loading template. When we created our project scaffolding, the scaffolding tool automatically put a view inside of the shared folder called loading. And here's the HTML file on the right. So instead of just showing the location of the file, why don't we create an h1 tag that says loading? You could put an icon or something else in here. Next, let's come down to the action function so I can show you how this works. This is where the majority of your logic for a specific route controller can go. As you can see, by default, it just calls this.render, which renders out your main template and all of the yield regions. I've opened up the browser and started the application so we can see our work as we make these changes in real time. Now, just to show you how this works, instead of just calling render with no parameters, I can specify the name of a template here. Let's, instead of rendering the main or the default template for this controller, let's just render the loading template. Now you can see on the right that instead of loading in the to-dos detail template, we just load the loading template. I could even load this into a specific region by passing an options object and the to option with a specific region. So, for example, I might load this up into the breadcrumbs area. Now what I want to do is I want to show the loading template only while we're waiting for data from the server. So I want to update this action function to wait until our data is ready, and then when it is ready, we'll render out the main template. But in the meantime, we'll show the loading template. So what are we typically waiting on? Well, we can wait on anything, but normally we're waiting on the results of a subscription. So up top here inside of the waitOn function, this is a little bit confusing because we're not actually waiting, we're not blocking any code from running. This is just a function that runs before anything else. It runs before our action function is called, and it runs before any hooks are called as well. So if you're going to subscribe to something, you typically do it in your waitOn function. But you can do something special here. You can return the result of calling subscribe, or you can really return anything that has a ready method. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. This does something special. It adds the result of this call to something called a waitlist. What the waitlist does is when we call this.ready, this will return true if all the items in the waitlist are ready. In other words, when we call their ready methods, they all return true. So if we're ready to go, we'll just render out the regular template. Otherwise, we'll show the loading template. Now this is a little bit hard to see because the data is ready almost immediately. If I refresh the page, you can see the loading indicator flash very quickly, but to make this more clear, I'm going to print something to the console. When we're ready, I'll say that we're ready. Otherwise, I'll say that we're not ready. And what you'll see here is that this action function runs twice. The first time it runs, this.ready returns false, and so we print out not ready. And the reason for that is because we haven't received our data yet from the subscription, and when we call the ready method of the subscription handle, it returns false. Then once the data becomes ready, it's reactive, and so this function will rerun again, and then it'll say that we are ready. So this.ready is a reactive function, just like if you were to call Meteor user or is logging in. To make it even more clear, let's not subscribe to any data. Let's just return a custom object that has a ready function. And what that ready function will do is just return the result of calling session is ready. And actually, just to be a little bit more explicit, we'll say that it's equal to true. So we're getting a reactive data source for free here because session is a reactive data source. And we're returning an object that has a ready method. That's the only requirement for returning something from waitOn. So now if I come over into the JavaScript console, I can play around. Let me set the session key is ready to true. And keep your eyes trained on the user interface above. And as soon as we do that, the loading template goes away. Now, we don't actually see any of the subject or title for the to-do rendered out because we're not grabbing the data from the server anymore. So when we call todos.find, it's just returning null. So what I'll do is get rid of this and subscribe again to our to-do detail subscription. And when I press save, we should have our data back in the right. One more thought about the waitOn function. Currently, we're only subscribing to one subscription, and we're waiting on that. We can subscribe to multiple things inside this function. And if we want to add those items to the wait list, we can add it to the return value by just returning an array of one or more subscription handles or objects with a ready method. If we want to subscribe but not add those items to the wait list, we can just subscribe like normal but not return the result. So you can use any combination of these that makes sense for you, and then use the ready method of the controller to make use of the state. Now, what if I wanted to reuse this logic across multiple route controllers? So it seems like a pretty common idea to use or show a loading indicator when we're waiting for our data. So what I can do is plug into the routing process by using a hook. It's called a hook because we're hooking into the process. So to start off, I'll just create a hook that only applies to this route controller. I want the hook to run before the action function is called. So I'll use the onBeforeAction function. And this method takes a parameter called pause. We'll use that in a sec. And then I'll copy this functionality up here, except let's just make this function do one thing, and that is if we're not ready, we're going to go ahead and say that we're just going to load the loading indicator. And then back in the action function, we'll just have the default render function. Okay, we have to do one more thing in this hook, and that is if we're not ready, we don't want the action function to run. We want to pause the controller from running the downstream functions. So I can call the pause method here, and that will pause the downstream functions from running. Now, usually if you're going to create a hook like this, you want to apply it to more than one route. That's kind of the point of doing it. So let's cut and paste that function and head up to our actual router file. And I'm just going to create the function here and call this the render loading hook. Then I can apply the hook to a particular set of routes by calling the router dot and then whichever hook method that I want to use. In this case, I want to apply it to the onBeforeAction hook. And so I'll just pass in the function as a parameter. Then if I want to apply it to all hooks or all routes, I can just do this. If I only want to apply it to specific routes, I can say use the only option and provide a set of route names. So in this case, I only want to apply this to the to-dos detail route. And again, it's a little hard to see, but if I refresh the browser, you can see the loading indicator briefly shows up. Now in this case, it turns out that the render loading hook is one that comes out of the box with Iron Router, so we don't need to write this ourselves. We just did it so that you could get a better understanding of how hooks work. Instead of writing this ourselves, we can just use the out-of-box loading hook by providing it as a string. And there's two hooks that come out of the box. One is called loading, and the other is called data not found. We're not going to talk about data not found in detail here, but essentially what it does is if the data function returns a falsy value, it renders a not found template for you automatically. Before we conclude, let me tell you about some of the other hooks that you can make use of. We've used onBefore action. You can also use the onAfter action. Again, passing a function, and if you want, only applying it to certain routes. You can also call the router.onRun function to provide an onRun hook. This will get executed when the route first runs, and these functions will only get called once, even on hot code reload. So it's a great place to put things like mixed panel tracking, which we'll talk about in another video. Then you have also router.onData, and this hook will get run anytime the data changes. And finally, you have onStop, and that'll get called just once when the route is about to be unloaded. So onStop hooks are a great place to put things like code that resets session state back to a regular value so that you can clean up after the controller before the user navigates away. In this video, we took a closer look at how route controllers work and how the waitOn function can work in combination with an action function or with hooks. And then we looked at how we can add the out-of-box loading hook to one or more controllers.